Hello everyone, my name is Seraphi and I'm happy to meet you all. And today I'm going to be giving you a full guide on how to play Legends of Runeterra. There's not a lot to talk about in Duel Links right now with the Rush event going on, so I'm going to take a couple days off from making Duel Links content and instead just talk about another game that I'm really enjoying, so that maybe some of you guys will be interested in playing it, maybe you guys will be interested in watching more content from it, streaming, whatever. Let's take a look. So, Legends of Runeterra is a card game by Riot Games, and it's quite fun. Let me just take a look at this deck I just built, and we'll discuss what the cards are, how it works, that sort of thing. So, the primary goal of Runeterra is you have 20 health for your Nexus, and your opponent has 20 health for their Nexus, and you just want to drop your opponent's life to 0 before your life runs out. Also, if you run out of cards, you lose the game. 40 cards in the deck, and let's talk about it. So, there are several types of cards in Runeterra, and the most obvious card is the unit. A unit is a card that has health and power. So, this is very similar to a monster in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a card that you can summon from your hand. It remains on the field until it is removed from the field, or destroyed, or returned to the hand, or obliterated, something. And each turn, you can use it to attack, and you can also use it to protect yourself. So, let's discuss a few key points here on this card. At the top left is the mana cost. So unlike in Yu-Gi-Oh!, Legends of Runeterra uses a mana system. This allows you to gatekeep how many cards you can play in a turn. So in Yu-Gi-Oh!, you can just basically play any card that you draw. But in Legends of Runeterra, you get mana, and that mana fills up automatically every turn. It's like Magic the Gathering, except that you don't have to worry about bricking on lands, or failing to draw lands, or not drawing the right color. That's all gone. There's only one type of mana, and you add it to your mana pool automatically at the start of every turn. There are cards that you can play that will give you additional mana, but they aren't necessary. It's just a strategy if you want to opt into it. So, at the start of each player's turn, that player gets 1 mana. And unlike a lot of other card games in Runeterra, both players play at the same time. It's just that one player is designated as like the turn player. That player gets the attack token, so they are allowed to declare an attack, and they are also the person who gets to go first. But when it's your turn, you play a card if you're able to, or you can choose to pass. Then it's your opponent's action. Your opponent will either play a card or they will pass. If both players have passed one time in a row, the turn ends, even if a player could play a card. So you have to be careful about kind of like bluffing, trying to hold out, waiting for your opponent to do something, because if you have the attack token and your opponent just doesn't want you to attack, they'll just end their turn after you've already, even if they have like 7 mana, because they can just completely deny your ability to attack if you pass them. So be careful about that sort of thing. Anyway, so because there is a limit to the amount of mana that you can spend every turn, that means there's a limit to the number of cards you can play each turn. And that means that there are not FTKs or one-turn kills in Runeterra. The game is slow and is not about setting up an unbreakable board or going for lethal immediately or doing some sort of long combo. It is about making trades and being strategic and utilizing your resources so that over several turns you could potentially end up with more monsters per turn than your opponent. Maybe you've inflicted more damage to your opponent's Nexus than they have to yours, and maybe when you both start to run out of cards, your board is better than your opponent's board. Or could be that your strategy is to make sure that you don't run out of cards. So while your opponent is trying to spend cards on removal or building a board, you could be spending cards on drawing more resources or generating more resources. These are all options for how to play the game. And it's pretty fun. So, in addition to the mana cost, we have the power and the health. So a unit's power is how much damage the unit deals when it strikes. So a unit will strike if it attacks or if there is a card played that tells it to strike. So there are ways that you can have little fights between units outside of the actual attack phase, and there are plenty of cards that do that. A unit's power can increase in several ways. A lot of units have the ability to increase their own power. They can be buffed by other cards that give them power either temporarily or permanently. If they have certain keywords, their power will increase. Or you could even equip them with a weapon that gives them additional power. All of these are options. The other stat down here is the unit's health. So, in Runeterra, units have health, and health is the amount of damage a unit can take before it dies. Therefore, if you have two units fight, they will strike each other, and then you compare the power of the unit to the health of the other unit. For example, my Buru Cultist is a 2/2. If I attack into a unit that has 3 power and 2 health, both units will die. Even though the opponent's unit is stronger, it does not have enough health to withstand my Buru Cultist's attack. Similarly, if I attack into a unit that has 1 power and 4 health, neither unit will be destroyed. However, my Buru Cultist will take 1 damage, and the 1/4 will take 2 damage. Therefore, my Buru Cultist will now be a 2/1, and the opponent's unit will be a 1/2. There are cards that heal units to potentially restore their health if they've taken damage, but those cards are few and far between. Now, if you take a certain amount of damage, your unit will die. And it's not like in Magic the Gathering. In Magic the Gathering, a unit will restore its health and remove any damage at the end of the turn. That is not the case in this game. It's more like Hearthstone, where the unit does not restore its damage at the end of the turn, and therefore, over several turns, you could potentially destroy a very powerful unit if you deal enough incremental damage to it. So, like I said, we start with 20 health. This 2/2 is not going to kill me. It's not going to, if I summon this card and go for my opponent, they're going to take some damage. It's not going to be an insignificant amount of damage, but it is not going to win the game. So again, this is not like Yu-Gi-Oh! Where the game is decided on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. You guys are having a fun time going back and forth, making trades. Battle actually matters, stats actually matter, and cards and how the order that you play them actually matters. Now, we have a couple of other things on the card. This is the card's region, Bilgewater. So there are several regions based on the different worlds in Runeterra, and if you want to play a card, it has to come from one of 2 regions. That's basically like colors in Magic. So you can mix, say, Bilgewater and Demacian cards together. However, unless you have a special origin that allows you to ignore the rules of deck building, if you have Bilgewater and Demacia, you can't put Noxus cards in there because you are required to only play 2 cards, 2 regions. That's it. So you can mix and match, but they have to be up to 2 regions. We also have a tribe. This card is a cultist, and that is relevant for the Darkened Blade origin, which is part of this deck. So that doesn't really impact the card in any way, but it allows me to do certain things if I play a certain number of cultists, which is not really that relevant for the video, but this is where the tribal keyword is if you're looking for it. Lastly, we have the card's effect. This card says, when equipped allies attack, deal 1 damage to the enemy nexus. That's really good. So this is an effect that will allow me to put pressure and play very aggressively, which is good for a low-cost unit. It allows me to establish the tempo of the game and say that if my opponent wants to, say, pass for 3 turns, they are going to be in a significant disadvantage. And if my units are cheaper than my opponent's units, I want to at least put pressure on my opponent while I have the initiative on the board, so that it makes it harder for them to come back when they are able to summon their more powerful units later. Therefore, you want some good effects, and there are plenty of good effects on low cost, medium cost, and high cost units. Now, generally speaking, I'm sure you guys can understand this, the higher cost a unit is, the more health it will have, the more power it will have, and additionally, the more mana that you have to spend, the more damage you can reasonably deal. So for example, if I have 1 mana, I'm not usually going to be able to deal 4 damage to a unit. There are some exceptions, but those exceptions are rare, and they have certain conditions. Likewise, if my opponent has 1 mana, they are unlikely to be able to summon a unit with 4 health. There are some units that do have 4 health at 1 mana, but those units have certain restrictions, or maybe they can't be played right away, that sort of thing. So, as a general rule, the stats of the cards and the mana cost that you can use to have a spell or weapon that could potentially remove an enemy are kind of gatekept. And it evens out about. So, like, generally speaking, a 5-cost unit will most likely be able to be removed by a 5-cost spell that would destroy it. Okay. Now, moving on, we have 2 types of units. We have followers, and then we have champions. So, followers are basically any unit that's not a champion. You don't need to know how they work, because I've already explained how they work. Everything that I've just told you about applies to both followers and followers don't have any additional rules. But champions are different. So let's take a look at a champion card. So, a champion not only is a special type of unit, but it's also a rarity. It's the highest level rarity, like a UR in Duel Links. But the important thing to note is there are no non-champion URs. There are no non-champion cards. So essentially, there are no expensive staples in Legends of Runeterra. We'll talk about the monetization a little bit. So there's not cards that you really absolutely have to have that are the highest rarity. Like, for example, Crackdown, right? Crackdown is a UR, expensive, hard to get, especially if you want 3 of it. That's not the case in Runeterra, because the highest rarity cards, the most expensive cards to get, are champion cards, not spells, not followers that you can put in any deck. They are very specific, very unique cards for a very specific archetype. So the monetization of this game is actually really, really good. It's one of its major selling points. We'll talk about it. But essentially, you can rest assured that if you want really good cards, they are going to be epic rarity or lower for the most part. All right. So Kayn is one of the champions. So you can see he has a mana cost of 5. And his stats are pretty low. He's only got 2 power and 5 health. Now, you would usually expect a 5-cost card to be about a 5/5. So this is a pretty weak card overall. But it does have some really good effects. So first of all, it has the challenger keyword. I'm going to do a separate video about keywords, so you guys don't need to worry about that for right now. And it has, when I kill an enemy, heal me for 2. Okay, that's pretty cool. So if you manage to strike an enemy and destroy it with your 2 power, then Kayn will be healed for 2 health. So potentially, if Kayn strikes a 2/2, he deals the 2 damage, which is valuable to you. Then he also gains 2 additional health, which essentially turns him from a 2/5 into a 2/7. You have to do a little bit of work, but a 2/7 is a little bit closer to what you would expect from a 5-cost card. So, now we have this little spot down here. This says level up. Now, what is that? Champions have 2 forms, and a level up is what happens when it's a condition that you have to meet either while you're playing the game or specifically while the champion is on the field. And once you've met the condition, the card transforms into a more powerful version of itself. Generally speaking, though not always, a champion will get +1 power and +1 health when they level up, and they will get a more powerful version of their own ability, and that ability will still be within the theme of the deck. The champions are cards that you're building your deck around, right? So for Kayn, to level up, I've struck twice. Then when I level up, recall me. Recall is another keyword. I'll go ahead and explain what that one means because we actually need to understand how this card works. Recall is return the card to the hand. So Kayn has to strike twice, which you can do with battle or you can do with a card. And then once you've struck twice, the same Kayn, not a different Kayn, and the card has to survive, of course. You can't, if it strikes and the strike would reduce its health to 0, say if it's attacking into a 5/2, then it won't level up. But this will allow Kayn to advance to his next form. So when Kayn recalls, he becomes this card. Kayn, 0 mana, so you do have to take the card back in your hand, but replaying it does not cost you anything. It's basically just a way for you to choose which form of Kain you want. And if you know anything about League of Legends, you'll understand why you have to choose 2 forms. Anyway, play Transform Me and all copies of me into either Rost or the Shadow Assassin. Okay, so level 2 Kain, if you choose Rost, is a 5 mana 3/6 with Challenger and Overwhelm. So you get an additional keyword, +1/+1, and when I kill an enemy, fully heal me and heal your Nexus for 2. So before it was when I kill an enemy, heal me for 2. Now it's fully heal me and your Nexus can be healed. Now, healing the Nexus is not very common. It's a very, very useful ability, don't get me wrong. But it's not a common ability. There are a couple cards that can heal your Nexus, usually like only a couple per region, so you can't really like double down on that strategy. So having a champion that's able to heal your Nexus every time it kills an enemy is very, very powerful. And the auto-equip thing is like it's very important that you understand how the auto-equip works, but it's a little bit complicated. So I picked a bad champion, basically. Essentially, this is what the level up, how it works. And then if you choose the Shadow Assassin, it's the same thing except that it has elusive instead, and elusive means that the monster can't be blocked, which is much better for actually closing the game out. So you basically choose whether you want to be able to drag the game on and get some good healing, or if you want to just kill your opponent as fast as possible. Great. Okay. So that is units. Basically everything you need to know about units in 15 minutes. Now let's talk about other cards in the game. So we have equip cards. The Darkened Staff. Okay. This is a little equip symbol. It's like a hammer. This is the mana cost. Now with equip cards, you can play them with spell mana. So I said that you might pass instead of playing a card. When you have mana and you pass, that mana can be stored. You can have up to 3 mana from a previous turn that you can only use to spend on spell cards and equips. So for example, if I go first, I have 1 mana, and I choose not to do anything. Next turn, I will have 2 mana that I can spend on anything. Spells, equips, units, whatever. Then I will have 1 spell mana. Let's say I pass again, then I will add the additional 2 spell mana to my spell mana pool. Now I have 3 mana that I can spend on anything and 3 spell mana, which means that I could potentially play a 6-cost spell on turn 3 if I chose to skip my first 2 turns. With that in mind, spells have to be balanced very carefully. But it's a very useful way for control decks to play. If they don't have too many early game units, at least they can build up some spell mana, potentially spend that mana to get additional mana gems, or clear the board, or maybe draw cards. Very good, very good options. So, you can spend 1 mana of any type to equip the Darkened Staff. And it gives the unit 0 power and 0 health. So there are other equips that give like 2 and 3, or 2 and 1, or 1 and 0, you know, it depends on the weapon. It also gives the unit impact and strike, refill 1 spell mana. Cool. So as long as it's equipped, the unit gets these benefits. Now, how equipped work is you can't play them unless you have a unit to equip them to. And equipping a card is a slow action. You can't do it in combat, and once you've done it, you pass to your opponent. It's not like a spell card where you can potentially keep playing the game. However, if a unit that is equipped with a card dies, the equipped card comes back to your hand, rather than going to the graveyard as well. So that's different than how equips work in Yu-Gi-Oh! Essentially, the equip card can be permanent as long as the unit does not get obliterated specifically. If a unit is obliterated, then any cards that it had equipped go away, sadly. So, this is very, very good. And you basically would play this card as frequently as possible to as many units, and there are a lot of units that get benefits from having equipped cards, and there are some units that don't, but they might benefit from having good stats. Whatever. Let's take a look at a couple other equips so you guys can see kind of what it might look like. This is the Darkened Harp. It costs 2 to give the unit 2 power and 0 health, and then also First Strike. That would be a much more aggressive equip that you would want to play on a monster that you want to battle with or something like that. So yeah, That's how equips work, and not too much else to say about that. Now let's talk about spells. So a spell, as you can see, has no power and no health. Right, so how do you use it? Well, a spell has mana, just like any other card, but you can play it with spell mana. So you can, this card has 4 cost, therefore you couldn't play it with entirely spell mana, but if you had, say, 1 regular mana and 3 spell mana, you could play this card, or you could play like just a 1 cost unit. You can see you have different options depending on the flow of the game. When you play a spell, its effect will go on the stack, and then it will resolve based on if it's a slow, fast, burst, or focus spell, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So, this card has an effect that says an equipped ally strikes an enemy. That effect will happen, and then after that, the card goes away. Alright, now, summoning units does not create any sort of stack like it does in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where, like, if you summon a unit, your opponent can't then just be like, oh, I activate this card and it's going to destroy your unit immediately. You will pass to your opponent as soon as you summon a unit, and then they could play a card that could destroy your card. But there's not specifically an instance where you play a card and it is in limbo waiting for your opponent to say yes or no, you can resolve that card. Units just come down, equips just come down. Spells do not do that. Spells will go on the stack, and then it depends on what type of spell it is, whether your opponent gets to respond or not. Furious Wielder is a fast spell. Fast spells are probably the most common forms of spells. They are the spells that you would expect. They are spells that deal a lot with removal, with drawing cards, with potentially interacting with the board in some way. And how a fast spell works, you can play it in combat. So you can't play units in combat, you can't play equips in combat, but in the middle of a fight, you can choose to play a fast spell. And then once you've played your fast spells, your opponent can then react to them. The fast spell will go into the middle of the board, and your opponent could play a card, and you could play a card in response to it, and then you guys just keep going until you both pass, and then all the spells resolve in reverse order, just like a chain in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, the difference between fast cards and other cards in Runeterra is that fast cards will pass priority immediately. So the other cards, like burst cards and focus cards and slow cards, if you play a slow spell, which I'll show you an example of a slow spell in a minute, if you play a slow spell, then you can chain a fast spell or a burst spell to it. And you would then immediately get to... Well, you can chain fast spells too, or you can chain burst spells to fast spells too, but if you play a fast spell, you can play... No, there's no difference. You can still chain. You get priority before your opponent. So you can play as many spells as you have mana for, and then when you choose to stop playing spells, then your opponent gets a chance to resolve. But essentially, like, you could play like a slow spell, and then you could also play Furious Wielder, and then your opponent would get to respond to either one of those cards. Now, you might think, okay, well, that's cool. If I can respond to my own spells before my opponent gets to, I can chain block. No, that's not how that works. So in Yu-Gi-Oh, there's not like a physical chain, so you can't point and choose to which card you want to negate. It just is the last card, which is why chain blocking is a thing. That's not how this works. And there are cards that negate cards in Runeterra. Here, let me show you an example. So this is a card that just stops cards. It says, deny. Stop a fast spell, a slow spell, or a skill. Okay, so that allows you to take a card off the stack, essentially. However, if you have 2 cards on the stack, your opponent, they are like physical, they're in the middle of the board. And your opponent, if they play deny, can just click on the spell or skill that they want to negate. So you can't your order doesn't only matters for like the resolution of the effects. It doesn't matter for whether your opponent can negate it or not. They will still be able to negate whichever card they want to. Okay, so that's how fast spells work. Now let's look at a slow spell. Fast spells are the spells that you would most interact with. They're like cards like that deal damage. They're cards that like here's Get Excited. 3 mana to play, discard a card, deal 3 to anything. To deal 3 to a unit, deal 3 to the Nexus, You can do this during the middle of combat. You can do this in response to your opponent playing a card that might buff a card, something like that. It's expected. You can play cards in response to your opponent's cards, and the cards that you play are cards that remove things from the field. Makes sense. Slow spells are effects that are bigger, much bigger. And slow spells can be played at the same time as a unit. So if you have priority, you can play a slow spell. However, you can't do it in combat. And if you play a slow spell, your opponent gets to immediately react to it, and you can't chain anything. You can chain your own spells to it, but you can't. Once you've committed to the slow spell, it has to resolve before you can do anything else. So let's see. Let's take a look at a slow spell. How about Weapons of the Lost. This is an 8-mana slow spell. Deal 3 damage to a unit, and then summon a Trifarian Shieldbreaker. So because this is similar to a fast spell, because it would allow you to destroy a unit that has 3 or less health. But because you're summoning a unit as well, you're bringing out a 6/5. That's a huge threat. Then your opponent gets much more time to deal with this sort of card. You can play Weapons of the Lost, and then when it resolves, you're bringing out this big 6/5, but then your opponent could be like, oh, I need a blocker, and they can summon something before you can use the 6/5 to then threaten something. So that's why this is a slow spell. Slow spells are pretty powerful. A lot of them do really good things. I think there's one that, come on. So there are lots of spells there's a spell that gives all your units +3/+3 until the end of the turn. There's a spell that doubles your unit's power and health. There are really good, powerful spells that just have huge impacts, and therefore they have to be given the most time to react to. Next up, you have burst spells, and burst spells are the most fun to use because they are essentially spell speed 4. You essentially get to play as many of them as you want. They resolve immediately, and they don't have any sort of stack. As soon as you play a burst spell, it will resolve, even if there's a stack. Let's say that you play a card like Deny, and there's another card on the stack. The Deny would go on the stack. Your opponent, you would have to pass to your opponent. They would be able to deny your Deny or do something else, and then once they've passed, then the Deny will counter the other card, and then you would go through the chain. However, in the middle of that chain, if you play a burst card, because you have you have initiative, you can play any number of burst cards you can pay for. The burst card does not go on the stack; it just immediately activates. And so, an example of a burst card is, I think it's called Standalone. Yeah, Standalone. 4 mana burst. If you have exactly one ally, grant it +3/+3. There you go. So you can play this card in the middle of combat. You can play this card in response to your opponent playing a card that might destroy your unit. Your opponent doesn't get to react to this in any way. They can't counter it. They can't just deal more damage to your unit in response to you playing the card. The card resolves. Burst cards immediately resolve. There's no interaction. So that's fantastic. Burst cards. Typically, burst cards, for the most part, are the weakest effects. They just give you something immediately, something that you really need. But it won't have too much of an impact on the board for the most part. It just very few burst cards will summon a unit. Most of them will just give you a little bit of stats, or maybe draw you a card, or maybe they'll generate a card for you, something like that. But they are not going to win the game by themselves. They just kind of give you an edge so that you can continue to play your fast spells. Pretty good. Then we have focus cards, and focus cards are a little bit tricky to describe. Okay, so a focus spell is like a burst spell in that when you play it, it will immediately resolve. However, a focus card cannot be played in combat, and it cannot be played while there are any spells on the stack. So it's essentially like a burst spell, but you can't play it except when you could play a sorcery, if that makes sense. So it's like it has the restrictions of being played only when you could play a slow spell or a unit, but it doesn't use the stack and it will resolve immediately, like a burst spell. Cool. Most focus spells will give you some powerful advantage. They do give you keywords. They give you buffs to your units. They'll give you extra cards in your hand, that sort of thing. The main thing about focus cards is that you can't use them to save your units. If your opponent tries to destroy one of your units, you can't play any focus cards in response. So you need to have some burst cards to use to protect your units, and the focus cards can be used to essentially prepare your units to then go into battle. Because you could play a focus card, and then immediately, like after the focus card is resolved, then you can use your attack token to declare attack and go into everything. So those are the 4 different types of spells. That's my best explanation for it. Okay, so that's the spells, and that took another 15 minutes. Okay. That's spells and equipment. Let's talk about landmarks. Landmark. A landmark cannot be played with spell mana. So it's just like a unit. It sits on the board just like a unit. However, it does not have any power or health. A landmark is essentially like an enchantment or a field spell. It will sit there and it will provide you some sort of benefit. And then it can be destroyed by either you or your opponent. Anytime that you have a maximum of 6 units on the board, and the landmarks take up a space for your units. However, you can, if you have 6 units on the board, you can always play more cards. It's just that when you do so, you have to choose which unit you want to remove from the field. That unit gets obliterated, so if it has a last breath effect or something else that triggers when it dies, that doesn't work. It's not dead, it's just gone from the field. And then you play the new card in that spot. So Inner Sanctum has Reputation. I cost 3 less. So it can cost 0 in certain instances. It has Countdown 1, create 2 lucky finds in hand. Countdown is a landmark keyword that essentially says it counts down, and then when it hits the countdown, it destroys itself and gives you some sort of benefit. So Inner Sanctum in particular is basically like a card that just gives you it's like a delayed spell, right? In one turn you get lucky finds. Cool. There are some other examples of landmarks that have much bigger effects, like let's say the Grand Plaza. Let's look at the Grand Plaza. The Grand Plaza, 3 mana. When an ally is summoned, give it +1/+1 and challenger this round. Anytime you summon an ally. So it works on your turn, it works on your opponent's turn. If you summon 4 allies, all of them get +1/+1, all of them get challenger. As long as the Grand Plaza remains on the field, all of your units are getting challenger for some period of time. So that's a huge, powerful effect. It's an epic card for a reason. Your opponent can only stop this because it doesn't have any health. They can't destroy it with a card that does damage. They can't attack it. They can't challenge it. So the only way that they can remove this card is with a card that explicitly destroys landmarks. So unlike in Yu-Gi-Oh, because there's no health, a lot of cards just destroy units. They will just destroy monsters. That's not very common in Runeterra. There are cards that just flat out destroy, but dealing damage is much more common. But as far as landmarks are concerned, yes, there are cards that basically just either will recall landmarks to return them to the hand, so you have to pay them again, or destroy them. Okay. And then that is basically it. So you have the attack phase and everything else. Let's go into a game so that you guys can see what it looks like. Alright, so I have a burst spell, an equipment, and 2 units. When I start the game, I can just choose any cards to remove from my hand, and then I can draw different cards randomly, and it could be the same card, but still. This allows you to kind of fix your hand, so if you brick, you can rework. I'm going to toss back the cards that don't cost 1. Give myself some more options going first. I have the attack token, I can see that. Alright, so I got a 1-drop, that's great. My opponent has a landmark, the Buried Sun Disk, with a countdown of 25. So, I have 25 turns to win the game, basically. I'm going to summon my Brood Cultist. Alright, my opponent has passed. I have the attack token, so I can declare an attack. I can attack with all my units at once, and then all of them will go in. I've dealt 2 damage to my opponent's Nexus. Then it passes to them. Now they have the attack token. The opponent is going to play another landmark, and I am simply going to end my turn. Now he has the opportunity to spend his 1 spell mana, or utilize his story. This is a card that I didn't talk about. It's like a special type of landmark. So the story lets him summon 2 sand soldiers. We'll kill one of them. And now that's back to my turn. So now I have 2 spell mana because I didn't do anything. So I have 5 mana total, but I could play this 5-cost spell if I had an enemy. But for right now, I'm going to summon my 2-cost unit. The opponent is going to use their second effect to predict. And then they can summon a unit. So that was a focus effect. All right, we're going to equip, and then we'll equip again. So we spent spell mana for that. That's fine. Now we're out of mana, but we still have our attack token. So we're going to attack, and we have equipped allies this turn. So Buru Cultist will deal 1 damage. This is the skill in the middle of the screen. If he had a deny, he could play it right now. And as you can see, since my unit got destroyed, the equipment came back to my hand. Oh, it's important to note, I forgot about this. You can only equip a card once, a specific card once per turn. So you can equip as many equip cards as you can pay for. But if a specific equip is removed from your field and then comes back to your hand, it's like locked until your next turn. All right. Let's summon Runeterra, which is a champion. So we're going to play our Ranger Knight Defector. Now, we just drew Kane. That is because of my origin. So I told you guys that if I played a certain number of cultists, that something would happen. If you play 4 cultists, then you immediately draw Kane from your deck, which is great. My opponent has their story. When you summon an ally this round, give it +2, +2, +0 this round. I wonder why you didn't do that. That would have been very helpful as Renekton. All right, he has the challenge ability. Oh, I forgot to explain how combat works. So when you attack, your opponent gets to choose whether they block or not. That's why I only blocked 1 unit last time, and I chose which unit. But he has a challenger here, so he could choose to attack my unit. I couldn't do anything about it. All right, we have 5 mana, so we're just going to summon Kane. That triggers our other origin. So since we played multiple different Darkins this game, now we have to draw Aatrox. And the opponent surrenders. There you go. So that's how the deck works. As you can see, my opponent spent a lot of their resources trying to establish a board with their landmarks, but the board that they established was largely temporary. The units that they summoned from the story went away immediately. Meanwhile, I was building a board. I had equip cards that could repeat themselves. My units had lots of health, and I was about to slay his Renekton with my Kane, which would have been very beneficial to me and very bad for him. There you go. That's how Runeterra works. My name is Seraphi, and I was thrilled to have all of you with me.